Sugar and Spikes is a science-backed and semi-sarcastic mental health podcast for a new type of business leader. Mental health concerns are occasionally addressed, but this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat any condition, mental, physical, metaphysical, or otherwise. That's a job for your doctor or therapist, not a podcast. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get on with the show.
Welcome back to another episode of the Sugar and Spikes podcast. I am Dez. I am a serial content creator, marketer extraordinaire.
What?
No. Siri.
Don't say anything.
Siri had thoughts.
And I'm Tammy, faithful friend, and also a psychologist.
Mm-hmm. So this week's episode is a follow-up to the last episode that we did where we were talking about projects where
Public speaking.
Well, public speaking and projects where you're really invested in the topic, because you can kind of see how it applies beyond just some sort of monetary or transactional, I guess, sort of occurrence and has a larger meaning. And so there's added pressure and you want to make sure it's right. And I'm not talking about like the traditional perfectionistic, well, I just want it to be good type of stuff, but the feeling of like X, Y, and Z rides on this and it's larger than who I am or what the company does, things like that.
Yeah.
As well as public speaking, because a lot of times those projects involve public speaking.
Yeah.
And that was one of our most literal examples of an episode informed by our experiences.
Right. Yep. Boy, did that go great.
I talked a little bit about a project I'm currently working on, but really, Tammy was the one driving us.
Yeah.
And we mentioned that we would come back and do a follow-up with how it goes. I do want to talk about kind of where we left it and remind our listeners what we thought was going to happen.
What did we think was going to happen? Okay, so I had been asked to do a presentation, and I really wasn't given very much guidance as to like what they wanted. So I made my best guess of what I thought, ran it by some people, practiced it, and then, I mean, it was clear from the beginning that we were not on the same page. And I think you and I had talked about what might happen, and we were like, maybe just some really intense discourse.
Yeah, you said something along the lines of, it's going to be Rotten Tomatoes and pitchforks. And me, being ever the optimist, apparently, I was like, it's not going to be that bad. If anything, you'll get some really intense laser stares and challenging questions.
Yeah, so there was said from the outset, there will be no questions. Nobody is speaking. There will be no questions. And I was like, oh, I kind of built questions into it.
Yeah.
And so I think that was like the first, like,
things aren't going right.
Oh no. Yeah. Like, I don't know how this is going to go. So I don't know. Do we want to say what happened?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, like,
I hate talking about it and like being like, we're just being so like talking around it, but also like,
well, I mean, there's confidentiality stuff, and we've talked about boundaries and everything before, and how, yes, we're both very much working professionals, and we use that to fuel a lot of the podcast. And in regards, like, in order to have that continue to be a thing, we both respect, like, our employers, and we respect our industry, and we respect kind of the, like, the division of
this and that.
Yeah, because no one's representing
right.
the employers, no one's representing kind of that form of profession. Like, yes, you're a psychologist, but you're not here in a therapist or psychological role, and all of that stuff,
right.
So I think
we apologize for the kind of guarded language that we're using around it.
But there's a lot to be taken away, and why we're using this as fodder for these episodes is because I do want to own up to something, because we've talked a lot about being scared to take risks, and one thing that we've talked on the podcast a lot about was, okay, well, what you do is you think about the absolute worst case scenario, and then you think about the absolute best case scenario. And what's really interesting is, and if you don't feel comfortable kind of building out what happened, I can take a stab at it and you can fill in the gaps.
Okay.
But what kind of happened, and this is skipping a lot, what ended up happening was, in fact, way worse
than I thought.
Than either of us actually thought was going to happen.
Yeah, it was way worse.
So there is a conversation to be had around what happens when things do just kind of come out of left field and no one saw that coming.
Right, because I think everybody was like, it's going to be fine. It's not going to go as badly as you think it will. And I think there's a place for that in preparing for stuff like this. But also, you're right. It didn't go as badly as I thought it would go. It went way worse.
Exactly.
And it was just watching it happen and also not being able to do anything to stop it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I guess to set up kind of the situation in general.
You set it up, I think.
Yeah. I'll try and you can fill things in. I think in the last episode we mentioned Tammy was asked to do a presentation.
Yep.
An informative educational presentation.
Yep.
And as she mentioned earlier, it was very ambiguous. Well, yeah, the ask was very ambiguous.
Right.
And the topic was extremely heated, extremely polarizing.
Yeah.
Something where folks kind of on both sides, if we get to the extremes of both sides, a lot of times logical sense on both sides
goes
out the window.
Yeah.
And she was asked to be the expert on this topic and in front of. So I think also another thing that kind of did you in at the start was we didn't have an idea of how large the crowd was going to be.
Yeah, no. There were a lot of people there.
I read one report that said close to 300 people.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
For a lot of folks who maybe do public speaking and stuff, you may be like, well, that's not that much. But when it's a hot button topic and it's billed as a informational community meeting.
Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Then
how many people do you think are going to show up?
I don't expect hundreds of people to show up. Especially around the holidays. This happened in the heart of December where everyone else has a million other things to do.
Yeah. I was surprised by how many people were there. And so I was a little thrown off by that. And I was a little thrown off by the way the structure was set up, which is fine. I could have coped with that. And that was, went through in my head, okay, so I'm going to have to adjust this piece. Because we had built a break-in for conversations.
Yeah.
So you know what? Let's just talk about it and then we can edit as we need to.
Sure.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So I got to slide 2 and I don't know, 50, 75 people stormed out in angry protest.
Shouted things
at me and was like,
and
slide 2. And I hadn't even said any of the most controversial things.
Yeah. And like I was watching it, so I couldn't be there in person, but it was live streamed.
Now everybody's gonna go look for it.
And I was stunned.
Yeah, like I didn't even know what to do. Like I just stood there.
Well, and like we talked about like Rotten Tomatoes and everything, and I was honestly expecting someone to throw a water bottle. And like just so folks kind of do understand like the level of heatedness of the situation, not only was it a walkout, at least one individual was escorted out by authorities.
Yep. And then there were authorities in there the rest of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so that happened at the beginning of your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you were asked
to continue
to skip to one very specific section.
Yep. And I did that.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked about what I needed to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I was pretty rattled. I'm not going to lie.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of like, oh, well, I was expecting this. And I'm trying to keep going like as best I can. And then I got to the end and somebody literally said, so that's the end? And I was like, yes.
Because you had her skip
right.
a
so
lot
I
of the presentation.
skipped a lot of it. And then when people got up to talk about questions, you could tell nobody had really heard anything after that because they were asking questions specifically related to things that I had talked about.
Yeah.
So like because there was a section at the end for questions, not like during my presentation, but there was a section at the end that was like dedicated to questions. And some of the questions I was like, but I just talked about that. I think in my head.
And you weren't one of the people being asked questions.
No.
Yeah.
So like
you couldn't say, as I mentioned.
Yeah, no. So once I was done, I sat down and then the meeting carried on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that happened. And then the next day, there's a lot of kind of community fallout.
A
A
lot.
Yeah. And it was interesting. Like, I can't imagine how you felt going through it because, like, as I was watching everything unfold, even I was faced with I cannot believe it went down like that.
Right? I know. But maybe that was part of my problem, right? Like, I talked to you about this later, and I'm like, I was doing things that from my lens, like, answered, like, what was asked for. But that was also coming from a place of, like, maybe we'll have some heated discourse, but ultimately everybody's going to be on the same page.
Yeah.
And that was my mistake.
And the way I can explain the response in the most neutral way possible was the responses I saw were those that I fully thought were only reserved for reality TV shows.
Right?
Like, you don't expect to see in real life.
I
know. And then afterwards, there were days of emotional processing, and I think
that was rough. I mean, it was really difficult to go through that. And I kind of didn't know how to make sense of it because I was just like, it just felt really surreal. Like, oh, that really happened. I didn't think that happened.
Well, I think it was twofold because it challenged your worldview.
Oh, yes.
And it challenged mine. I think it challenged a lot of people who were kind of involved and knew about what was going on. Like, no one was like, told you, except one person said one thing and totally was like, yeah, I said that would happen.
I know,
right? But so for a lot of us, our worldview is challenged. So there's that level of processing. But for you, there was also, and I think this is really important and something to kind of unpack in terms of any professional environment and project. And when you get feedback is when you put your heart into it, any response feels like a personal response and reaction towards you.
Well,
especially when they make it towards you.
I mean, it was.
Yeah.
So there was like, they're not, so you don't really, and can't really get judgment on your work. Like, who can say whether that was a good presentation because of what happened and that I had to skip a bunch of it, and then what happened at the end, which nobody was listening to, but I kind of almost don't blame them because we had just had like a large number of people like screaming as they left. And so
well, at that point, like your senses are on hyper alert and you're operating at like a level of wanting to be safe versus let's talk about this really intense topic in this complicated way.
Yeah.
And let's be like, no one, and I would say even you at that point, no one was at a level of like reasonable functioning.
Right.
You know, because everyone's emotions were so heightened.
Yeah. And I also didn't know, to be honest, if I was going to get out of that building.
Well,
I was like, I don't know. Like,
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, there's a concern for safety. And I think one thing is when it happens in a large group, even if things aren't directed towards you. So if we're talking about audience members and stuff, like even if things aren't directed towards you, you're still going to be on high alert because there was a threat and things were happening outside of like the schema that you have for how this is going to go. Yeah. So you're still on alert and not listening to anything else. And you're just like, what's going on?
I remember like picking up my water bottle, and I don't know if it was from like adrenaline or fear. It's probably all of the things. Shock. Like my hand was like shaking and I'm trying to take a drink of water to kind of like compose myself and somehow finish out the rest of the presentation. And I was like, yeah, so that's a thing. So I ended up being fine in terms of making it out of the building. And I mean, I didn't even look at the stuff. I didn't look at the comments.
Don't read the comments.
Yeah, that's going nowhere good. So you read them, and then our guest star who was here before, Megan, she read them, and then I kind of got like
the Cliff's Notes.
Yeah.
The play-by-play.
And I kind of like didn't know what to think about. Like I had felt like I had done something wrong. And I was like, but I didn't. Like I wasn't rude. I wasn't mean. I like was genuinely there to provide some education and hopefully like start to like alleviate some of the concerns and the anxiety. Because I even said that in like my opening statement or whatever. And so I was like, I don't know how it got to this of me feeling like I really did something wrong.
And I think there are a couple of things there. Like, as you mentioned before, the audience, you weren't the first one.
No,
right?
No.
So, like, you were brought up maybe an hour or so into everything. And the way the other presenters had kind of gone about their business,
they were more guarded, and it was clear that people had not informed me about the back and forth on this topic. So I was starting from a place that I thought everyone was starting from, and that just wasn't the case.
And I mean, with the information presented beforehand, it was already information that a lot of people kind of weren't happy with and had their own thoughts on it.
Yes.
And it was essentially like with certain members of the audience, and I think on both sides, depending on what piece of information you're hearing, like right now I'm not saying anyone was right or wrong. It was a very intense thing.
Yeah.
The fires had been fanned.
Yes.
You know,
for sure.
So then an hour later you come up.
Yeah.
You weren't set up for success.
No, not at all.
I think that's what I'm getting at is...
And I don't know if that was like intentional or unintentional. Like I can't really speak to that. So I can see ways that it was intentional and ways that it wasn't. So it's really hard for me to say.
Yeah.
But I think the thing is it was clear there had been a lot of heated discussion ahead of time that I didn't know about.
Right.
And if I had known, I probably would have presented my information in a different way. So, but then again, maybe I wouldn't have. I don't know.
I mean, it's hard to look back and think like what you would do in that situation.
Yeah.
But I think
I learned some really valuable things going forward. So, I learned that I probably have to have specific things established at the outset, like in terms of my bio and the scope of my work and like where I come from and that kind of thing. And I think that if I had done that, it might have maybe the situation still would have happened, but maybe in not as like a volatile way that it did. And making sure, even if they don't ask, that the people who ask you to do the presentation get their eyes on it before you do it. Because that was not a request. And had it been a request, I think some of this could have been avoided.
Yeah.
Because they could have given me the feedback of like, don't do this. And I would have changed.
Or this isn't what we're looking for.
Right. This isn't what we're looking for. Do this. And then I could have changed course and done and kind of met the criteria that they wanted. But when you leave it super broad, I think what happens is you end up doing it from your own perspective. And I think it was just this like weird, like everything lined up just so that it's actually really not surprising that happened.
Yeah.
Even though no one expected it to.
I think one thing that I keep going back to as we're talking is this idea of knowing your audience. Because I think, at least, and I think I told you this, when we were prepping and everything, I had a lot of biases about who the audience may be and kind of, you know, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I kept trying to keep it in check and not projecting those assumptions. And in that, ended up missing the mark on who the audience was.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah. I think there was this assumption which can be dangerous for a lot of folks because we always think that like those extremes, no matter what the topic is, those extremes don't happen. And there's this assumption of, well, we can all be professional and stuff like that. Like,
yeah.
I think I mentioned something along those lines to you. And what it comes down to is this unfortunate fact, and we're really kicking off the year on a positive note, is those extremes. Well, we know of those extremes because they happen. Right.
They're outliers. Yeah. They don't happen very often, but they do happen. Yeah. And I think in this case, like I said, it was just this, like the perfect storm almost. Like you never get it where this happens, but it happened and this is why. And so like looking back on it now, you can be like, oh, okay. Like I see that. And I think that not being from Indiana really hurt me. Like I feel like I didn't really understand. It felt like a cultural divide. Like you talk about being culturally competent, and I know a lot of people talk about that in relation to like minority populations, but I also think in this case that being from a more liberal state where that's where I was raised and that's what I know, and coming here is I didn't really have a good understanding of what I was walking into. And there were other people that did, but they weren't the ones asked to present. And so I ended up doing a presentation, if you really want to get bare bones about it, that wasn't very culturally competent because it was done with this assumption that like maybe people have heated discourse, but we're really going to come to a agreement in the end. And that was just naive and ridiculous because that's not what happened.
I think it was, and this bites you in the ass every time, your academic background coming into play.
Right?
You know, like looking back and looking at how things played out, you built a presentation that was very much in line for, you know, either mental health professionals or undergrad kids. Like it was
like, here's some science for the foundation. Here's how we're going to tackle some common misunderstandings, and then here's how to advocate.
Yeah.
But see that right there, the advocacy piece,
no one cared about.
No. Like, because they weren't coming from that place, whereas I was. And so you're right. It was built for a different audience than the people who received it.
Yeah.
Even though it was a good presentation. Like, I didn't do anything wrong
No.
necessarily. It's just, it was really not well received.
It wasn't built for the audience.
Right.
Yeah.
And I thought it was. So it wasn't like I thought I was presenting to mental health professionals. I think I just didn't have a good understanding of like that cultural divide and how far I am away from that extreme.
Well, I think like it comes down to, and again, you mentioned it in terms of like asking people and getting feedback and everything, but like operationally defining things.
Yeah.
You know, like, oh, you're asking for, and this wasn't the ask, you're asking for an advanced presentation on X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
What's advanced for me may not be advanced for someone else. Maybe, you know, like unreachable for another person. So when you look at it that way, yeah, 100%. You like it fit the definition, like it fit the ask, but it didn't fit the audience.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I did want to touch on in terms of like follow up and everything was, and I do think this happens quite a bit in professional careers and everything, is when there's a mistake or something isn't in line and there's a negative outcome, and then that one mistake is used as kind of the scapegoat, you know? And if that's you making that one mistake, then you end up being the scapegoat.
Yep. Because that definitely happened.
And I mean, at that point, it becomes an exercise in like, I am not, like, my identity is not that, you know, like finding some sort of solace and understanding that there's a story for every perspective. And when someone uses something as a scapegoat, it's only because that person has the higher soapbox.
Yeah. I mean, also because I'm not a member of that community, I think it's easy to say, well, here's this academic person who doesn't understand our community and doesn't look like us and doesn't talk like us and has beliefs that we don't believe. And so it becomes easy to other me or other speakers because ultimately everyone else has to live in that community. And so you have to find a way to like kind of smooth out or tamp down all those really high emotions. And I mean, I get that. I get it. But also thinking back on it, like I go two ways about it. I go like, hey, I really didn't mean to do that. And I go to, hey, this really needed to happen. Like inconvenient truths are still true. And so in my moments of like, yeah, fuck the man, like I'm like, no, that needed to happen. And then when I'm on kind of this more hurt side of things, I'm like, yeah, that maybe I made a mistake. But truthfully, I don't think that I did.
No.
I just think I know what I'll do differently next time if I'm ever asked to do it again.
I mean, it feels cliche, but like it's possible for something to be done appropriately and still be very much a learning opportunity.
Oh, for sure.
You know, and I think that a lot of us, we have this kind of like false idea of if it's good, then I'm really not, then sweet, I knew what I needed to know.
Right.
And if it's bad, then oh crap, I messed up and all of these things.
Yeah, it felt very personal in the beginning. Like I told you, like I just feel like I did something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, well, what do you think you did wrong? And I'm like, I don't know. Because I don't know that I did.
Mm-hmm.
But I still feel like I did.
When you have someone yelling at you,
yeah, screaming at you as they
like,
walk out. Yeah.
you're gonna feel like you did something wrong. Which, I mean, to be fair, was I want to say it was a bit of the goal of stuff.
I mean, my goal was to chat.
Not for you, but
Oh.
but if we think about what were other people who
What was their goal?
engaged in behaviors, what were they trying to get from their behaviors?
Yeah.
They wanted to shake people.
Yeah.
You
true.
know, that, and they when you are on polar sides of things, again, no matter what side you're on, you want to feel like I'm right, you're wrong, and you want this very clear delineation. So if someone is able to make you feel like you did something wrong, I would argue in their mind it's a win, because now your beliefs are challenged, and
Right.
now you know, like,
I know, and I think it was really fortunate that what the answer that I came to is I didn't do anything wrong.
mhm.
There might have been things that I would have changed to kind of set myself up for more success, but like on some level, we're talking about a whole group of people
Mhm.
that are significantly disregarded,
Mhm.
and that seems to be okay with folks.
Mhm.
And so any message that's going to come and say, that's really not okay, and this is why,
Mhm.
is going to be explosive.
Mhm.
So I probably could have avoided some of it,
Mhm.
but I don't know that I could have avoided all of it.
No, you were in a powder keg.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But
And I think like that, I kind of want that to be one of the bigger takeaways, is there will be times where you go through these kind of mental exercises and think, what's the worst that can happen? I guarantee you, a handful of times throughout your life, it's going to be worse.
it was worse.
It's
So
going
much
to be worse than what you thought was the worst possible outcome.
Yeah.
And if we can use you as a lovely example, you get through it.
Mhm.
You know?
Because we were going to try and do this kind of debrief
Mhm.
a few days ago, like last
Mhm.
week, and you were like, no.
No.
No. You need to like figure this out, and we need to
Mhm.
talk about it some more, and like you need to take away what you can from it.
Mhm.
I think like the next day I was just kind of like almost in shock, I think.
Mhm.
And just kind of like,
I mean, I didn't sleep that night.
I know.
Like,
oh my goodness. It was rough, but like, I mean, like I said, truths are inconvenient and they're still true. My dog's here today and loving on Dez.
But like, to kind of break down how you've gotten to this place, because I think what is interesting is, from like when we're recording right now, it's been 7 days or 8 days. Like, it's been a very brief amount of time.
Yeah, a week, maybe.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the place you're in now is completely different than the place you were in 12 hours after it happened.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So I'm wondering if maybe you can take us through kind of like the pieces that kind of helped you get to this place of, you know, how you're able to talk about it so calmly and everything. Because I mean, even during the time of us doing this podcast, there have been times where like shit's gone down in my life, and it's like 6 weeks later and I'm still just like a wreck.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, those were more significant things. And second, I will say I got a tremendous amount of support. Tremendous. Which really meant a lot to me, because I was like, I don't know. Like, I really like upset some people. I don't know if that's okay. And like the thing is like that wasn't my intention. And so I always try to come at things from a place of compassion. So I felt like, was I not being compassionate? Like, usually people can hear messages the way I say them and like they're fine. Or if they're not, it's like, well, have you thought about this? Well, no. Have you thought about like it just leads to more discussion. But you're right. That's like an academic kind of, not an exercise, but can kind of get in the way of seeing clearly what's going to happen. But they did get a lot of support. I got a lot of support. I came over. We talked about it. I got another perspective from you, from Megan, from Dean, from a lot of my coworkers. And so that felt really nice. And just because I was also going into a break, because I had already had leave, helped me have a little bit more space. And then I think we were talking about something like totally disrelated, and you said something, and I was like, oh, yeah. Like, you said something about like people always say liberals are snowflakes. And I'm like, okay, but they walked out on slide 2. Like, it was too threatening. They couldn't even hear it. So I don't know. That just really somehow helped to change my perspective of like, I was way past what people could cope with. But also, I think where I can't even talk today. I really went wrong was thinking that there was something I could say, some way of introducing what I was introducing that would bring people together. And I don't think that was ever going to happen.
Yeah.
So, like, I did not have a clear idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So along with like not really understanding the audience, not having a objectively like understood or an objective understanding of what is possible within the situation, because I think you're right.
Yeah.
Because when we were working on the presentation, we talked about what are we hoping with this, and it was very much a creating some understanding,
bringing people together,
like let's have a discussion, and 100%,
yeah,
20 to 30% of that room did not want that.
Yeah, and I think that's where I went wrong. I think ultimately I thought people wanted to know and they wanted information and they wanted to come together, but it was very clear that people did not want to come together and were in very different camps. But I will say that a couple people did thank me, so that felt nice. Somebody reached out only to tell me that they had learned a lot from the presentation that I did give. And that felt really nice. And then like 2 people had come up at the end of the when the meeting had like concluded and said like, thank you so much for coming. So, I mean, that's not near as many as who stormed out, but also like I was able to take something away that there were people in the audience who did find it helpful. So it reached the people it was designed to reach, though, didn't it? Yeah. So the people who were there with an open and kind of curious, it did reach the people it was designed to reach.
Well, and I think that's one thing is at the end of the night, it felt like a complete cluster.
Yeah.
Which on one hand it was, and it wasn't 100% had that reaction.
Yeah.
And I think if we think about it in terms of almost like, I wouldn't say it was a standard curve, but if we think about it in terms of like a curve, there were those folks who were super heated. There were a lot that were in the middle, and then you got to see the kind of fruits of, that long tail where it was a handful of people that really got it.
Yeah.
So there was true benefit in what had happened.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had the bell curve, right?
Yeah. And I think that also speaks to this idea of it went worse than we expected. And now knowing what the outcome could be, it wasn't as bad as it could have been.
That's true.
Because you could have it's very possible that you could have had that same experience and not gotten those couple pieces of positive feedback.
Yeah.
Or not had the confirmation that folks were thinking about it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, somebody reached out to me on social media. I'm not exactly easy to find on social media.
Yeah.
Or maybe I am. Everybody's going to be like, we found you. Like, no problem.
hey.
That was easy.
But you tell people how to find you on social media here.
That's true. Well, they find you. They don't find me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they could. But I don't know. That felt meaningful. Like, it was important enough that somebody found me on social media to make sure that I knew that they had personally benefited from what I said or the information that I provided. So that did feel nice, and kind of just trying to hold on to that amidst all the chaos and bitter feelings. I don't know the word I'm exactly trying to, like, the dog's barking just like got me all thrown off. But from the people who were way out in the outlier area.
Yeah. It showed that, I think it shows that no matter what situation you're in, you will have two sides of the curve. You know?
Yeah.
Which, when things feel really, really shitty and really, really tough and like things couldn't get any worse, I feel so disgustingly positive saying this, but like there is some sort of positive to be found. You know?
Well, and like, if it did nothing else, it really opened my eyes to what people face here. And
the climate.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think it would have been possible had that not happened to really have me see that, like, oh, like, so even in that sense, it's valuable. Because now I see, I'm like, okay, so we're not starting where I thought the starting line was.
Yeah.
We're way back, like so far back, I couldn't even see it from my starting line.
Yeah.
So, and it helped put into perspective of a few other things that have happened throughout the time that I've been here, where I was like, I really don't understand why I'm getting pushback in this way. And now I'm like, oh, I get it now. Okay. I understand. And so I think helping put all of that kind of into context was really helpful. So I try to take things away. I did emotionally, like, I was a pretty emotionally wrecked after for a few days at least, but like in those times it's okay, right? So it did not go well, and so it's natural, especially I think in that case, that you're going to have a lot of strong feelings, and trying to pretend like you shouldn't or don't is not helpful. And so I wasn't immediately trying to find something kind of beneficial from what I learned. I was more just trying to deal with like my numbness or my shock, or like feeling like I had done something wrong, and helping kind of manage that distress, and then looking for like, what are the takeaways? So I think maybe sometimes people think like, oh, I'm just too emotional, but no, they're your emotions, and they're happening, and they're telling you something.
Yeah.
So taking space for that before you try and jump into the debrief and figure out lessons learned, you have to really take care of yourself first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, I think we talk about it quite a bit, but I do want to reiterate, emotional processing is work.
Yeah.
Like, you say it all the time, like, therapy is hard work, and going through something that stirs up such strong emotions, like, emotional exhaustion is real.
Oh, yeah.
So it may feel really hard or even counterintuitive when you go through an experience like this to quote unquote shut down, or, you know, take that space and not engage with much.
Yeah.
And that's when your brain and, you know, like the deeper parts of you are doing a lot
Of work.
And what I've found that's interesting, and in my experience, has been in those days or weeks, depending on what the situation is, where you do give that where you do give yourself that space, like if I give myself that space, then after a certain amount of time, I do find that I wake up one morning and I feel significantly better.
Yeah.
And
and ready.
Like there is a rebound, you know, and in a sense you feel stronger.
Yeah.
So that's just something to kind of hold on to.
But that's that idea of like stepping back and not plowing ahead. So taking a rest, like what seems like a rest, is doing a lot of deep work that's working really hard. So just like when you go to sleep, your body is restoring a lot of things, restoring your body, restoring your mind. It's doing all these things. You have to let it do that. And it's almost like negative gain. Like you have to just get up to the starting line where you can start to say, okay, what are the lessons learned? But until you do some of that emotional work, I don't know that that's really possible. Like, I don't know if I had really just shut it down and been like, okay, well, now I'm just mad and fuck everybody. Like, if I could have taken anything away from it that was valuable. But to listen to what your emotions tell you that you need, which is like a break, and take the break and then see what happens. Because I wasn't looking for insights when they happened. They just happened.
I think, like, you touched on something that's really interesting when we think of, like, almost mob mentality and stuff, but the I'm really angry and blah, blah, blah. I think one piece to note, and for anyone who kind of goes through this and is looking for community, for support and everything, a strength that you had in your community is you had people that were skilled enough to give you space and didn't egg you on.
Yeah.
You know, because I think if you had been in a space where folks were like, yeah, they were just XYZ, like furthering the divide and riling you up, there's not a lot of good that would come from that. You know?
And like, because anger comes from more vulnerable things that you don't really want to deal with. I was like crushed that it hadn't been received well. That was not what I wanted. I didn't have an agenda. And so like people were misinterpreting what I did, and I felt very defensive about that. But then I had to kind of like, you have to deal with the more vulnerable parts beneath. Like, oh my gosh, what just happened? Like, oh no. Like, you know what I mean? And kind of dealing with those more difficult things rather than just getting mad. Where it's easier to be. It's easier to be mad than to be like sad or feel like you've let someone down or anything like that.
Yeah. And I think like for folks listening, if you're looking for kind of a litmus test on how does your network support you in those times, doing a check of like after you leave a conversation, how do you feel? Like, do you feel more ramped up? Do you feel like things are worse? There's more stakes. They pointed out things I didn't even think about, and Jesus Christ, you know, things like that.
Yeah.
Or do you feel heard?
Yeah.
Do you feel like folks held space for you, which sounds really new agey and like woo, but
it wasn't like anyone
neutral in a sense.
Yeah, it wasn't like anyone approached me in like a woo place. It was more just like, how are you? They didn't want to necessarily talk about the specifics of what went down. They're just like, how are you?
They cared about you as a person.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't know how I am.
Yeah.
So I think one for one, the people who did reach out to me were like, how are you? And they knew, obviously, like if I had said, oh, I'm fine, like everybody knows that's not true. And so I think, you know, the care that went into, because I think it would have been easy to be like, we need to talk about this. But, and that'll come, I have no doubt. But not then. It was more like, let's contain and let's support and let's help with you first and then move forward to kind of a more debriefing that is going to come. I know it's coming.
Yeah.
But I have, you know,
space
for it, and I learned a lot. And there are a lot of things, if I do a debrief, that I could say, like, here's where I think I went wrong. Because those are the places where I definitely went wrong. Like, I just did. So anyway, that's what happened.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaways for folks who find themselves in that sort of situation is, giving yourself that space, going into a project or presentation or anything like that with very clear, defined understanding.
And if you don't have a clear understanding, don't be like, okay, well, I'm just like this. It's not like I was just like, okay, I'm just going to do my best. But it was more like, okay, here's where I'm starting from. But if I had clarified, if I had actually written and gotten some guidance, I think I wouldn't have started there. So if it's ambiguous, get your questions answered.
Ask a handful of clarifying questions. And then, doing that emotional work. I think there's an element of distancing yourself from like you as a person versus the project and presentation and topic at hand, and then making sure that your support network is actually supporting you and not perspectives.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
All right.
Okay.
That's what we got this week.
It's a lot.
Guys, maybe next week we'll be back with more fun things. I mean, we'll be back next week, but who knows the tone.
I mean, the last thing I want to say is just because you're feeling more difficult feelings doesn't mean you failed.
Yeah.
Like, maybe that anger and that explosiveness, it was clearly already there. And so because that happened doesn't necessarily mean that I did something wrong, because it was there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
Bye, friends.
Bye.